The soft hum of voices and clinking glasses filled the house, the party winding down as relatives and friends said their goodbyes. I lingered near the kitchen, my glass of soda still half full, watching the way Ryan moved through the room. He had always been like that, effortlessly charming, his laugh a magnet for attention. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, suddenly appearing beside me. His voice was low, warm, cutting through the noise like it was meant just for me. I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Just tired." Ryan smirked, his eyes flicking to mine before he leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. Tired, or avoiding me? The question caught me off guard, and I looked away, feigning interest in the stack of empty plates on the counter. "Why would I avoid you?" "Good question." His tone was teasing, but there was something behind his words, something I didn't want to examine too closely. The party carried on around us, but it felt like we were in a bubble, the air between us charged in a way that had become all too familiar. I tried to ignore it, to push it down like I always did, but tonight it felt harder to do. As the night wore on, the guests began to leave, the house slowly emptying until it was just me, Ryan, and the remnants of the party. "Looks like cleanup duty falls to us," he said, gesturing to the mess of plates, cups, and discarded napkins scattered around the living room. "Lucky us," I muttered, grabbing a trash bag from under the sink. We worked side by side, the room quiet except for the sound of crumpling paper and the occasional clink of glass. Every so often our hands would brush as we reached for the same thing, and each time my pulse quickened. I told myself it was nothing, just proximity, but deep down, I knew better. As we worked, the silence between us became almost unbearable, heavy with unspoken words. The mess on the table disappeared quickly, but Ryan seemed to take his time with everything else, his movements slow and deliberate. I could feel his gaze on me when he thought I wasn't looking, and it sent a shiver down my spine each time. "You've been acting strange all night," Ryan said, breaking the quiet as he leaned against the counter. He tossed an empty cup into the trash bag I held and folded his arms, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What's going on?" "Nothing," I said too quickly, busying myself with wiping down the counter. My voice was steady, but my hands shook slightly, betraying me. "I'm just tired, like I said." "Tired," he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. "Right, because you've been avoiding eye contact with me for hours. That's normal." I froze, the cloth in my hand still pressed against the counter. "I haven't been avoiding you." "You have," Ryan said, stepping closer, "and I want to know why." I turned to face him, my chest tight. He was standing closer than I expected, close enough that I could see the faint stubble on his jawline, the way his lips curved ever so slightly into a smirk. I swallowed hard, the room suddenly feeling too warm. "It's nothing," I insisted, my voice quieter now. "Just drop it." Ryan tilted his head, his expression softening. "Alex, talk to me." His voice was gentler now, and that made it even harder to keep up the walls I'd been so carefully building. I shook my head, stepping back and creating some distance between us. "There's nothing to talk about." "Bullshit," he said, closing the gap again. His voice wasn't harsh, but there was an edge to it that made my heart race. "You've been weird around me for weeks. You think I haven't noticed?" "I don't." I started to deny it again, but the words caught in my throat. The truth was right there, just beneath the surface, but saying it out loud felt impossible. Instead, I turned away, hoping that he would let it go. He didn't. Ryan reached out, his hand brushing lightly against my arm, and the contact sent a jolt through me. "Hey," he said softly, "whatever it is, you can tell me." I closed my eyes, willing myself to stay calm, to keep it together, but his touch lingered, warm and steady, and I felt my resolve slipping away. "It's nothing," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Just drop it, please." For a moment he didn't say anything. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until I finally looked up at him. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something searching, almost hesitant, that made my chest tighten. "Fine," he said at last, stepping back and letting his hand fall to his side. "But you know you're a terrible liar, right?" I let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over me as the tension between us eased slightly. "Yeah," I admitted. "I know." We finished cleaning up in silence, but the air between us was still charged, every glance an accidental touch leaving me on edge. When we were done, Ryan grabbed 2 beers from the fridge and nodded toward the living room. "Come on, let's take a break." I should probably... I started to protest, but he cut me off. "Sit," he said firmly, handing me one of the beers. His tone left no room for argument, so I followed him to the couch, sinking into the cushions as he settled beside me. We sat there for a while, the TV playing softly in the background as we sipped our drinks. The tension from earlier hadn't disappeared entirely, but it felt different now, quieter, more subdued. I could feel Ryan watching me out of the corner of my eye, but I kept my gaze fixed on the screen, pretending not to notice. "You know," he said eventually, breaking the silence, "I miss this." "Missed what?" I asked, glancing at him. "This," he said, gesturing between us. "Just hanging out, talking, being us." I smiled faintly, the knot in my chest loosening just a little. "Yeah, me too." He grinned, his expression softening in a way that made my heart ache. "You're not so bad to be around when you're not avoiding me." "Shut up," I muttered, but I couldn't help smiling. For a moment, it felt like everything was normal again, like we were just 2 brothers, well, stepbrothers, hanging out after a long day. But then Ryan shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine, and the illusion shattered. My breath hitched, my pulse quickening as I looked up at him. He was watching me intently now, his beer forgotten on the coffee table. "Alex," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I'm wrong, tell me to stop." I stared at him, my heart racing. "What are you talking about?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking to my lips before meeting my eyes again. "This," he said, his hand brushing against mine. "Whatever this is between us." I froze, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't supposed to happen. But the way he was looking at me, the quiet intensity in his eyes, made it impossible to deny the truth any longer. I started, but he cut me off. "Don't lie," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Not to me. Not about this." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening as the weight of his words settled over me. He was right. I couldn't lie, not to him and not to myself, but admitting the truth felt like stepping off a cliff, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to take that plunge. "Ryan," I whispered, my voice trembling. He reached out, his hand cupping my jaw, and I felt my breath catch. "It'll be our secret," he said softly, his thumb brushing against my cheek. "Just ours." Before I could respond, his lips met mine, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The kiss was tentative at first, almost hesitant, but it quickly deepened, the weight of everything we'd been holding back crashing down on us all at once. The kiss was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, overwhelming, intense, and impossible to pull away from. Ryan's hand slid from my jaw to the back of my neck, his fingers threading through my hair as he drew me closer. My mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding all at once, but they all dissolved under the weight of the moment. I didn't know how long we stayed like that, tangled together on the couch, the soft glow of the TV casting flickering shadows across the room. Time felt irrelevant, everything outside of us fading into nothing. All I could focus on was the warmth of his body, the pressure of his lips, the steady beat of his heart against mine. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads resting together, I struggled to catch my breath. My chest rose and fell in rhythm with his, our breaths mingling in the quiet space between us. His hand lingered on my neck, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin as his gaze locked onto mine. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was entirely true. My thoughts were a mess, my emotions a tangled web of confusion, fear, and something I didn't dare name. I think so. Ryan smiled faintly, his thumb tracing slow circles against the back of my neck. Good, because I've wanted to do that for a long time. His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and for a moment I couldn't speak. I stared at him, my mind scrambling to make sense of what he'd just said. You have? Yeah, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think you'd feel the same. I let out a shaky breath, my hands still gripping the fabric of his shirt. Ryan, I don't know what I'm doing. Neither do I, he said with a quiet laugh. But I know this feels right, doesn't it? I didn't answer right away, my thoughts too jumbled to form coherent words. But as I looked into his eyes, the vulnerability there, the quiet hope, made something inside me click into place. Yeah, I said finally, it does. The relief that flickered across his face was palpable, and he leaned in again, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was softer this time, less frantic, but no less intense. His hands slid down to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself sink into the warmth of him, the steady anchor of his presence. Everything else fell away, the confusion, the fear, the lingering questions. In that moment, all that mattered was him, the quiet connection we'd spent years ignoring finally coming to the surface. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, and I didn't want it to end. When we finally pulled apart again, the room felt different, warmer, quieter, as if the air itself had shifted. Ryan's hand rested lightly on my waist, his thumb brushing against the fabric of my shirt. This changes everything, he said softly. I know, I said, my voice trembling slightly. But maybe that's not a bad thing. He smiled, the kind of smile that made my chest ache in the best way. No, he said, it's not. We sat there for a while, the silence between us comfortable now, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. I could feel his gaze on me, steady and searching, but it didn't make me uneasy anymore. If anything, it felt grounding, like a reminder that I wasn't in this alone. Eventually, Ryan shifted, his hand slipping from my waist as he leaned back against the couch. We should probably talk about this, he said, his tone light but with a hint of seriousness. Probably, I agreed, though the thought of putting everything into words made my chest tighten. But not tonight. He nodded, his smile softening. Okay, not tonight. The unspoken understanding between us felt like a relief, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We didn't need to figure everything out right away. For now, it was enough to just be here, together. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the windows felt brighter than usual, the warmth of it spilling across the living room where I'd fallen asleep. I blinked against the light, my thoughts slow and hazy as I stretched. The events of the night before came rushing back all at once, and my heart skipped a beat. Ryan was still asleep on the couch beside me, his head resting against the armrest, his breathing slow and steady. His hair was slightly messy, his shirt wrinkled, but he looked peaceful in a way I hadn't seen before. The sight of him like that made my chest ache, a mix of emotions I couldn't fully name. I sat up slowly, careful not to disturb him, and glanced around the room. The remnants of the party were still scattered across the coffee table. Empty glasses, a crumpled napkin, the faint scent of spilled beer lingering in the air. It felt surreal, like I was caught between two versions of reality, the one where nothing had changed and the one where everything had. As if sensing my gaze, Ryan stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked up at me, a sleepy smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "Morning," I replied, my own smile tentative but genuine. He sat up, rubbing the back of his neck as he looked around. Guess we fell asleep down here. Yeah, I said, my heart racing as his eyes met mine again. The weight of the night before hung between us, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Ryan leaned back against the couch, his gaze steady. You okay? I nodded, though the knot in my chest hadn't entirely loosened. Yeah, are you? Yeah, he said, his smile softening. I am. The quiet between us was different now, less tense, more certain. It felt like we'd crossed a line we couldn't come back from, but instead of fear, there was a quiet sense of understanding. We didn't have to say it out loud. We both knew what this meant. Ryan reached out, his hand brushing lightly against mine, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. This is ours, he said softly. No one else has to know. I met his gaze, my chest tightening at the quiet intensity in his eyes. It'll be our secret, I said, the words carrying a weight that settled deep in my chest. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The morning lingered, every quiet second between us carrying a weight that neither of us could fully put into words. Ryan's hand remained on mine, his touch grounding, as if he knew I needed that anchor to steady myself. The sunlight spilling through the windows painted everything in soft gold, and for a moment it felt like the world outside didn't exist, like it was just us. We didn't say much. We didn't have to. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It felt warm, comforting, like a shared understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud. My chest tightened every time his gaze lingered on mine, the faint smile tugging at his lips like he knew something I didn't. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice soft and steady. Do you regret it? The question hung in the air, quiet but impossible to ignore. I shook my head, my fingers tightening slightly against his. No, I said, the truth settling over me like a weight lifted. I don't regret it. Ryan's smile widened, his shoulders relaxing as if he'd been holding his breath. Good, he said, because I don't either. The simplicity of his response hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. The fear I'd been carrying, the fear of what this meant, of what it would change, began to fade, replaced by a quiet certainty. This was real. Whatever it was, whatever it meant, it was real. We spent the rest of the morning together, moving around each other in a way that felt different but familiar. He helped me clean up the last of the party mess, his occasional brushes against my arm or shoulder sending small sparks through me. I couldn't stop stealing glances at him, and every time he caught me, he'd grin like he knew exactly what I was thinking. By the time the afternoon rolled around, the house was back to its usual state of order, and Ryan was packing up his bag. The knot in my chest tightened again as I watched him zip it shut, the reality of him leaving settling over me. Hey, he said, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. He stood in the doorway, his bag slung over his shoulder, his expression softer now. You okay? I nodded, though my throat felt tight. Yeah, I don't want this to be the last time. He stepped closer, his hand brushing lightly against mine before he took it, his fingers threading through mine. It won't be, he said firmly. I promise. His gaze held mine, steady and sure, and I felt some of the tension in my chest ease. He leaned in then, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was softer, more lingering than the ones before. It wasn't urgent or desperate. It was a promise, unspoken but clear. When he pulled back, he smiled, his thumb brushing lightly against the back of my hand. I'll call you, he said, his voice quiet but certain. Okay, I said, my own smile tentative but genuine. I'll hold you to that. He laughed softly, his hand slipping from mine as he stepped back. Good. And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood there for a long time, staring at the space where he'd been, my chest tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't fully name. Relief, longing, hope, they all swirled together, leaving me breathless and unsteady. As I sat down on the couch, the sunlight streaming through the windows, I let myself replay the moments we'd shared. The way he'd looked at me, the way he'd touched me, the way his voice had softened when he spoke my name. It was all still there, vivid and real, and I knew it would stay with me for a long time. This was only the beginning. I didn't know what the future held for us, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to find out. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. And that was enough.